On today's show, why are the Atlanta Hawks underperforming relative to expectations this season? Is it a Quin Snyder issue or a personnel issue? Plus, trade rumors are heating up surrounding Hawks star Dejounte Murray. What would a proper return look like for Atlanta? Should they be looking to move Dejounte Murray? It's all coming up right here at Locked On NBA.
You are Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On NBA, the biggest stories with the local experts. I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, also host of Locked On Rockets right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. They're the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. It's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks, you just pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. It's that simple. Look, Prize Picks is awesome. You can make your picks in less than 60 seconds and submit an entry. They've got quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of different players and stat types, which is what makes Prize Picks the #1 DFS app on the market. And now that basketball season's here and in full swing, you can pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League, a league created specifically for combo projections that include 2 or more players from different sports or leagues. For example, you could do LeBron James plus Travis Kelce to 10.5 combo of 3-pointers made plus reception. So if you've been thinking about getting into daily fantasy sports, you've got to try Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code LockedOnNBA, all lowercase, for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks is daily fantasy sports made easy. Joining us now is the host of Locked On Hawks, Brad Rowland, who can track down wherever you listen to your podcasts and on YouTube. Just search Locked On Hawks. And Brad, a bit of a rough December here for the Atlanta Hawks. Just a 4-10 mark here on the schedule for them. 13-19 on the season, 6 games below 500. You look up and down this Hawks roster, there's a lot of talent there. They brought in Quin Snyder to be a winning, championship level kind of head coach. So what's the biggest reason the Hawks are kind of underperforming relative to expectations this season?
Yeah, it's probably a tie between two things. Number one is just the defensive end of the floor. The Hawks are very, very poor defensively for what seems like the 3rd or 4th year in a row. They're not very good on defense. Part of that's talent, part of that's execution, all of that fun stuff. And then they simply cannot win close games. They finally managed to win what probably shouldn't have been a close game on Sunday, where they kind of almost tried to blow a pretty massive lead against the Wizards on the road. They won that game in quote-unquote close fashion. But the Hawks have been pretty terrible in the clutch this year. Their numbers are very unsightly there. And they actually, before that game on Sunday, they had blown a second half lead in 4 straight games, and they just can't seem to hold on to a lead. So a combination of late game execution and defense is kind of what leads you to a very poor showing so far.
6-14 in the clutch going into that Sunday matinee performance against the Wizards, which, yeah, the end of that game was a little crazy. They did their best to maybe almost give that one up. At this point, what's kind of the book on Quin Snyder, right? He gets hired super late into last season. This is his first full year, right? Goes through training camp, has, his feet all the way in on this team now, gets a chance to really start the year with this team. What's the evaluation of him to this point with this squad?
I think it's still kind of an incomplete, to be honest, which may not seem satisfying after, almost a full season now between the second half of last year and the first half of this year. But basically, they didn't change the roster hardly at all in between. And it feels like it's a roster that doesn't really match what he wants to do. They're kind of in this in-between mode where they're running stuff that's not necessarily catered to their talent, especially on defense. They're trying to play Quin Snyder's preferred style without Quin Snyder's preferred players, is the way it feels to me. Obviously, when you lose a bunch of close games, people are going to point to the coach, and that certainly is reasonable. I tend to lean on the bigger sample of Quin being a pretty quality guy from dating back to Utah. But at the same time, I think that everyone would kind of acknowledge like the huge changes have not been made necessarily to the results. Now, the profile has changed. Offensively, it looks a lot more like a Quin Snyder team. They're taking more threes. They're getting to the rim more, less mid-rangers. I think those were all good changes. It's just that defensively, they look a little bit different, but the results don't really look the same. So, I should say that the results actually do look the same in a bad way for the Hawks. So, I would say he's doing a fine job, but he hasn't been a huge difference maker either, which I think is what the Hawks were kind of hoping for early this season.
You talked about execution being kind of one of the issues there defensively. What specifically about the execution is kind of lacking so far with the Hawks defensively? Because last year they were 22 in defense. This year they've slipped all the way down to bottom 4. They're 27th right now in defensive rating.
Yeah, they've sort of sacrificed some of the baseline stuff from last year that they were actually okay at doing. They were playing a lot of conservative drop coverage, which can certainly get you beat. It's not a high upside defense, but they're playing less of that, which kind of goes away from their strength when it comes to Clint Capela and Onyeka Okongwu, their centers, who are their best defenders. They're playing more out on the level of the screen. They're playing more aggressively, and that has led to more turnovers, but it's also led to kind of unevenness and allowing a lot of threes, a lot of uncontested threes, and not to defend Quin Snyder necessarily, but their perimeter defensive talent is very poor on this roster. Jalen Johnson's been their only major injury this year, but he is one of their best defenders. He's been out for a while. Now DeAndre Hunter's out. Those are their 2 best defensive forwards, and really their best 2 defenders that are not centers on this team. So part of it really is a defensive thing. There's just that famous phrase about defense that's all about effort. Not really in the NBA. You kind of have to have defensive talent on some level. It's not all effort. You have to have effort too, no question about that. But I think the Hawks are kind of proving that they are playing hard defensively. They're just kind of limited in what they can do. So I think a lot of it has to do with just like putting guys in positions that are not fantastic for them. And I think there's probably a long-term goal in the mix there, but it's not really working in the short term.
You mentioned maybe, Quin Snyder trying to achieve some things without maybe the right personnel to do it, I guess, yet in Atlanta. One of the things that's been interesting is there have been some rumors kind of heating up around Dejounte Murray, potential trade rumors, involving him, which is a little weird that we're not even a full 2 years removed or almost a full 2 years removed from the big all-in move that the Hawks made to acquire Dejounte Murray. So at this point, should the Hawks be looking to move Murray, and if they are, I mean, kind of what would even a good return look like since you forfeited so much draft capital in the first trade iteration for him?
Yeah, I think that it's, for me, a situation where they should be listening on Dejounte Murray. I'm not sure they have to trade him, but I think honestly, with how middling their results have been for a couple of years now, I think essentially anyone other than Trae Young and now Jalen Johnson's coming on as kind of a foundational piece for them. Everybody else, that includes Murray, should be available to some level. And I think the rumblings about Dejounte were, I guess they're a little bit surprising when you put it that way, less than a year and a half into the experiment, but the results just haven't been there. I don't think Murray's been individually bad. I just think that it's probably fair to say after a year and a half, that transaction is not one that you would want to sort of do again if you were the Hawks. Pushing all that capital in, thinking you were getting a game changer in Murray, and then having your results, if anything, they've actually gotten worse. Not because of Murray, but their results in the last year and a half were worse than they were the previous couple of years. And I think that defensively, he hasn't changed their culture, all that stuff. As far as what you're looking for, it really comes down to what the organization believes right now. Because if you look at the results since the conference finals round, which we all talk about all the time here, that's still 3 years ago. And they've been a 500 team essentially since then. And when you talk about that, it's more like they're not going to rebuild right now. They're out picks in the future. They still have Trae Young, who there's no signs that he wants to be gone at this point in time or anything like that. So it's more of a retooling, but also, do you want to put more assets and kind of throw good money after bad? I think if you're trading Dejounte Murray, you're kind of doing not necessarily a whole reset, but more of a hard pivot into okay, take a step back, build around Trae, build around Jalen Johnson, and not necessarily sell him for nothing, but make it to where you have more flexibility, make it to where maybe you get some of that draft capital back, et cetera. So kind of depends on which team you're looking for. The Lakers are always out there as the big bad team. It's a clutch sports thing, all that stuff. But it kind of depends on who you're trading with. But I do think that the Hawks can kind of go different directions. It's kind of, if you're looking for a silver lining, they can kind of pivot in one way or the other fairly easily given where their roster stands right now.
And kind of, I guess, one other potential trade chip here with Onyeka Okongwu signing his rookie extension before the season and how well he's kind of played. I mean, what's the read on Clint Capela's future with the Hawks, right? Is he a viable trade chip? Is Okongwu ready to potentially step into that starter role if they could get somebody, on the trade wire for Clint Capela to get an improvement elsewhere, on the roster?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's actually a surprise. And I say this as someone who thinks that Capela is a good player. He's a very valuable, important role player, veteran guy. But I'm surprised he's still on the roster, only because they drafted Okongwu with the number 6 overall pick. And if you told me 4 years later Capella would still be on the team, I would be very surprised by that. Not because of Clint's play, just kind of the resource allocation of having those two centers that are still, they're both pretty good players. They played a little bit together this year, but in a vacuum, they don't really play together and all that stuff. So yeah, I think Capella is going to continue to be available. They came close-ish to trading him this summer. They didn't do it. Given where they are on the standings, it would make some sense to, if you can have find a buyer for him, to go ahead and make that move now. Not because it's going to make you worse, and that's kind of why the Hawks haven't done that so far. They're kind of hesitating to, because I think they know that trading Capella would make them worse in the short term. But big picture, long term, when you've already have a Okongwu signed, like you said, I think both DeAndre Hunter and Clint Capela are going to be out there in a lot of trade scenarios in the next month and a half, and eventually they're going to have to move one of those guys, because look, the Hawks don't like to pay the luxury tax. They've never paid the tax under this regime, and then if you look sort of down the road, they have a lot of money out there. So trimming some more salary is not going to be satisfying to anyone in the market locally. But if you follow the tea leaves of what they've been doing in the last couple of years, it's pretty likely to happen.
Last one for you here, Brad, because this is a guy that I'm actually really fond of his game. I wanted him here in Houston, actually. AJ Griffin, who I thought, he had a pretty strong rookie year by all metrics. And it felt like even before his little 8-game absence due to personal reasons, that he wasn't really like a mainstay or couldn't crack a consistent spot in the rotation. Kind of what's up with him this season? Why was that? Did he just fall out of favor with Quin Snyder? What's going on with AJ Griffin?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I mean, obviously, you talked about the personal absence. I don't really know what happened with that or what's happening with that. So that's always kind of a question, and personal reasons are personal reasons. So who knows? But to your point, before that, he wasn't playing a lot. I think that, the short, probably broad version is that they don't love his defense. And I get that. And it's not very good. I've also been advocating for him to play more. I would have just thrown him out there and gotten what you could get from him, because he's too talented for me to not play on a team that is where they are. If they were a title contender, I would get it more. But given where they are in their pecking order, not playing him doesn't seem like the best idea to me. But I think that given how many defensive issues that they've had, that's my best guess, and that's the only thing that I can kind of glean from the organization as to why he's not playing. He played a little bit less once Snyder took over last year, but he was still getting out there on a regular basis. So it's been kind of a lost year so far. I'm still a believer in Griffin. To your point earlier, the shooting is dynamic on the wing. Like, he's not the most high upside guy in the world, but I think there's a really valuable, if nothing else, a valuable role player in there. And I'm hoping that now that he's back from the personal absence, get some practice under his belt, and hopefully starting in January, can start kind of get back in the rotation, because I think long-term, he's still a pretty interesting piece for them.
Can the Atlanta Hawks get back to playing above 500 basketball? Will they be able to start closing out games consistently moving forward? Is there any retooling coming down the pipeline, either by way of moving Dejounte Murray or Clint Capela? You'll have us covered for all of that and so much more over at Locked On Hawks. Brad, thanks for stopping by Locked On NBA with me.
Thanks for having me.